All right, we are ready to get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESG-CV. My name is Kristen Delkamp, and I am today's moderator. If you're just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region that you represent. As a reminder, this office hours is being recorded for the public record. How to ask a question. Here's how to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat. Please type your organization and question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers throughout the presentation in the chat or out loud at the end, time permitting. As time allows, we will also unmute folks to ask questions live. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESG CV grant administrators, and other consultants who can help to answer questions during the Q&A session. If we cannot answer a question, we'll either get back to you or recommend that you complete a HUD AAQ. Please note that both the slides and the recording will be sent to all participants within 1 week of today's session. Today's office hours session agenda includes the following: ESG updates and resources, ESG CV updates, office hours updates, upcoming trainings, ESG and ESG CV Q&A, and today's spotlight presentation is putting the funding pieces together. And now I'm going to hand it over to Anthony for ESG updates.
Thank you, Kristen. And just one quick announcement. We're still reviewing the 2023 BOS Award applications. Sarah and Tuesday are in the process of wrapping that up. You will hear feedback on that. We will announce that sometime this month. I know we've got about 2.5 more weeks, but we will go ahead and do that soon. Next slide, please. And also, just to let you know, as mentioned last week, Tuesday Cool has been promoted to a specialist position. So she's no longer serving as an ESG team representative, but you can still contact your representative at the information located on the screen. And always, if you're not sure who your representative is, just go ahead and shoot an email to the ESG NOFA inbox listed at the bottom of the slide. And that's it. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you, Anthony. So some reminders for ESG CV. A reminder that those that received additional ESG CV funds, the final drawdown deadline is March 31st, 2024, and the final RFF deadline is April 15th, 2024, conveniently being held on tax day. For this slide, February office hours topics. The upcoming office hours include documenting VAWA compliance and the Tribal Cool Toolkit. Also, we have completed Coordinated Entry System Cohort Series 1 and are primed to start Cohort Series 2 next Tuesday, March 19th. The series this time will include fewer sessions with longer run times of 90 minutes. Session 1 is going to focus on what needs to be in place to have a powerful coordinated entry system, how to go about defining vulnerability and need, and how to develop a prioritization scheme. An email was sent this week with registration information, and registration information will also be included in the office hours wrap-up email. And at this time, do we have any questions? Let me check the chat. So we've got a question here from Deidre relating back to last week's spotlight. Agencies are asking for direction regarding the impact of AB 12, which states security deposits will be limited to 1 month rent beginning July 1st, since last week's presentation stated they are less than or equal to 2 months rent. You know what, Deidre, we're going to have to look at that presentation and get back to you. If we need to do a correction, we'll go ahead and send that out to everybody. I'll take a look at that and see what that looks like in the scope of AB 12. All right. And then a question: what was said about Tuesday? A question for you, Deidre. Are you responding to the cohort sessions starting on Tuesday, or the question is about Tuesday Cool, who is a former ESG annual rep? Oh, Tuesday Cool. Okay, Anthony, would you mind repeating?
Sure. Tuesday Cool was promoted to a specialist position within the ESG program. And so she is no longer serving as a direct rep. She was your rep, you've been reassigned, and you can go ahead and reach out to Tuesday and ask her to forward the information to the new representative, or you can shoot an email to the NOFA inbox.
Oh, thanks so much, Deidre. We'll all miss her in that role.
She's fantastic. She's fantastic.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, let's see if there are any more questions that have come in. I don't see any. Anthony, am I missing anything that you see?
No, not at all.
Okay,
Thank you,
great.
Amal.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well then, since we don't have a whole lot of questions this week, we're going to go ahead and jump early into today's Spotlight series. First off, contact us if you have any further questions. Please contact us. For annual ESG, reach out to your rep or ESG NOFA at hcd.ca.gov. For ESG CV, please reach out to your grant administrator. And now we'll go ahead and turn our attention to today's Spotlight series, Putting the Funding Pieces Together, hosted by Matthew Doherty and Cody Ziegler. Cody, take it away.
Thanks so much, Kristen. And thanks to you all for having us today. Really appreciate the getting invited to come talk about our Putting the Funding Pieces Together guide, also sometimes called our strategic funding guide. So let me start by just talking a little bit about who I am and where I work. And we'll let Matthew introduce himself as well. So I'm Cody Ziegler. I'm the Director of Statewide Policy here at the California Interagency Council on Homelessness. So if you don't know CalICH, we are the state's coordinating body around homelessness policy. So we are a council made up of 18 state department directors or agency secretaries, all of whom have programs or funding related to homelessness. So HCD is one of our council member departments, along with other state departments and agencies. So our goal really is to help coordinate the policy work happening at the state level around homelessness, and provide the most effective resources also for local partners such as yourselves who are actually implementing the funding and the programs and really doing the work on the ground. So one of our goals is to make it as easy as possible for you all to do that work. And so we do a number of things, including host our council meetings. We also have an advisory committee made up of experts on homelessness from across the state, who advise our committee or our council. We also are responsible for drafting and reporting out on the state's action plan for preventing and ending homelessness. So that's sort of the most comprehensive document recording what the state is doing around homelessness. And then we are also responsible for our state Housing First policy implementation. So making sure that Housing First is being implemented in a coordinated and effective way. To that end, what we want to talk about today is our strategic funding guide, which is a document that Matthew has helped us put together over the past few years, multiple versions of, which is really supposed to be a resource for you all. And Matthew just put it in the chat. Thank you. It's supposed to be a resource for you all to help navigate the often complicated web of funding opportunities that are out there around homelessness. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we do that, I'm going to pass it to Matthew to let him introduce himself.
Great, thanks, Cody, and nice to be with everybody today. I'm Matthew Doherty. I'm an independent consultant who's been working with the state and specifically with CalICH for the last several years. Have worked closely with staff there on the development of the action plan for preventing and ending homelessness, on a variety of the grant funding programs, on other tools and materials, and have helped lead the development of the Putting the Funding Pieces Together guide, which we first did early in the COVID-19 pandemic, especially dealing with all of the new resources coming into communities in response to the pandemic. But now we have updated to be kind of a standing resource that addresses the full range of state programs and a lot of the major federal programs, including ESG. and we'll dive into the details of that. Prior to being a consultant, I was the executive director of the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness and worked on helping shape a variety of the federal programs that are reflected in the funding guide.
Great, thanks, Matthew. So we can go to the next slide here. So this is just our introduction. We'll go to the next slide again. Great. So I'm going to introduce the guide a little bit, and then Matthew's going to dive into what the guide looks like and how we are hoping that folks can use it in their communities and in their work. So the purpose of this guide, as I said, is to really help inform people on the ground. So, right, folks with lived expertise, advocates, policymakers, and leaders from local, tribal, and continuum of care entities to really understand what funding is out there, both state and federal funding available to prevent and end homelessness, and try to help with the process of deciding which funding is best for which uses, right? So it's really intended to help support the decision-making that we know has to happen on the local level to say, we want to fund this type of program, or we have this need, what funding is available to fill those gaps, really with the goal of strengthening the capacity of our homelessness response systems across the state. It is not, as we say here, an exhaustive list of every funding source that may support our work to prevent and end homelessness, right? We know that a lot of different funding sources are utilized that touch on the homelessness response system. This is really a highlight of sort of the main or funding from the state and federal governments with the main purpose of addressing homelessness, right? And so we've tried to select sort of the biggest impact funding that we think is most relevant to you all and your communities. And it's not necessarily supposed to inform funding strategies for individual programs, right? It's more at the local decision maker level, understanding how to braid and combine that funding. So we'll go to the next slide and just talk a little bit more about, our vision for this work, right? We are hoping that, as CalICH, we are always striving to drive progress on reducing homelessness in California. And we know that in order to do that, communities need support and capacity to provide all sorts of a spectrum of service and housing options. So interim housing and permanent housing, as well as a whole host of other resources, right? So we also know that there is a delicate balance to be had around addressing the immediate needs of people experiencing homelessness and supporting their long-term stability and success. And in order to do that, we have to sort of balance the investments that we're putting into our system. So to that end, we sort of think about the different program types as listed here. I won't read through them all because you all already know what those are. But in the guide, we provide definitions for each of these program types, right? And identify which of these is eligible for the use of funds in each of the programs. So I'm going to pass it to Matthew to sort of go over the details of what's in the guide and how we think you all can use it. But I will be monitoring the chat for any questions. We'll also take questions afterward and open to any of your thoughts as we, do this in the future.
Great, thanks, Cody. Next slide, please. So as Cody referenced, we do provide definitions of the different interventions that could be supported through these different funding sources. You'll find those on page 8 and 9 of the guide. They're intended to be accessible definitions. They're not necessarily the detailed technical definitions that specific funding sources may require, but to give a sense of what the intentions of the different kinds of programs that might be supported are, spanning across the full range of homelessness response systems. Next slide, please. So the guide is intentionally structured to have two complementary parts so that it's easy for users of the guide to get to the right level of information that they want and need at that time, and dive deeper into information if they wish to. So next slide, please. So the first slide provides a pretty quick crosswalk of prioritized and eligible uses of the state and federal funding programs that are included in the guide. So there are two tables that are intended to allow people to look quickly, identify the funding source they're thinking about, see whether the uses they're thinking about are eligible or should be prioritized, or maybe of lower priority for that funding source. So really intended to be that handy reference when it sometimes becomes hard to remember which funding sources can cover which uses, and or which uses you might want to think about as being top priorities for those funding sources. Next slide, please. And then the second part provides much more detailed information around the state and federal resources that are covered in the guide. For each of those resources, we talk about funding and timing information. The eligible activities are identified. The status of implementation, where is the state or the federal government in the process of implementing especially the newer funding sources, and provide some tips and guidance for how to think about local uses of those funds. Again, as Cody mentioned, the guide really is intended to mostly support system level discussions, community level discussions about how to prioritize the different funds coming in, less about how to think about using the funds within specific programs at the program or organizational level. The guide does become out of date almost the day that it is issued. We're aware, and we don't have the capacity to keep it updated on a regular basis. So for each of the funding sources, you're always provided with the link to get the most current information about where things stand with that program. Typically, the guide has been updated on I think we're aiming for pretty much an annual basis, so that after each budget cycle, any new funding or changes in funding through the state budget would be reflected in the guide. So again, part 2 is really delving into specific funding sources you most want to learn about or think about, and to use it to support deeper conversations about how to use those funds within your communities. Next slide, please. So we'll start with part 1, which is the crosswalk. Here there are 2 tables that walk through the prioritized and eligible uses, first of the state homelessness funding programs that are included, and then of the major federal homelessness funding programs. And this is the part where you also will see the definitions of homelessness interventions that we showed you earlier show up in this part of the guide. Next slide, please. So this section is basically 2 tables plus the definitions, trying to put on one page the essential information that folks might want to understand about, in this case, the major state programs. We've tried to provide a relatively easy to understand scale of how to think about not only eligibility, but also whether the uses should be prioritized. So it's organized, as you can see, that the major funding programs each have a row. Even in this table, you can always link to the more detailed information about the programs. And then we use a scale of not eligible, trying to be clear when you don't even have to think about whether that funding source can be used, say, for instance, for rental assistance. That's just not eligible, not something to even consider. And then we identify prioritized uses, which are things that you should likely be thinking about, possibly using that funding source to support. And then we have highly prioritized uses, which is where we think about where you should first decide, do you need to use this funding source to support these interventions, or are you adequately covered for those interventions, and you can think about using it for other uses. I will say that throughout the guide, though we recognize that investments need to be made in the entire homelessness response system, there is a bias towards encouraging people to always think first about whether these funding sources can help expand your ability to end people's homelessness through permanent housing interventions. And so you'll see that those are often the highly prioritized uses, or if that's an eligible use, would ask you to think about first, is there a permanent housing intervention that can be supported with this funding that we need to scale up before you think about other prioritized uses. And then we also try to be clear when something might be, say, for the Home Safe program, the 3rd row from the bottom, that the services uses are what are highly prioritized for that funding source. When you think about PSH, you wouldn't necessarily think about spending Home Safe funds as a top priority on the operations or the capital costs of PSH. So that scale is used. We tried to create it in a way that would be pretty visually able to quickly identify the prioritized uses, but we've struggled a lot to how to get this information clear and concise on one page. And then you'll see the uses are aligned with the types of interventions we talked about earlier. So going through non-congregate shelter and interim housing, the state does have an emphasis on trying to support non-congregate sheltering options and interim housing options. And then rental assistance, which could be short-term, like rapid rehousing kinds of interventions, or permanent rental assistance, such as vouchers. And then PSH and service-enriched housing, and then diversion and homelessness prevention. The table doesn't include a column around outreach and engagement, which is one of the interventions that's discussed in other parts of the guide, partly for space, partly because most of the funding sources included don't actually have a prioritized use or eligible use for outreach and engagement, but something definitely still to be considering. And as you look at funding sources, if it can be used for that, that is identified in the other part of the guide. So here, just going to give an example that when we look at ESGCV, that the guidance the state was trying to encourage was that people really highly prioritize its use for short-term rental assistance and using it to invest into rapid rehousing kinds of interventions, things that would help support people to exit homelessness permanently, but also a prioritized use on non-congregate shelter and interim housing. But again, showing that the emphasis we're all trying to communicate is investing in the permanent solutions whenever possible. Next slide, please. So this is similar table set up exactly the same kind of scale, but this is for the major federal programs. And again, just communicating whether they can be used for these different intervention types and which of those intervention types would be prioritized. So we include here the regular ESG program is included here, though it's administered both through HUD, sometimes directly to jurisdictions, and through HCD directly to California jurisdictions, showing again the same emphasis on highly prioritizing the use for rental assistance, but also showing that interim or shelter solutions are a prioritized use. And here, what we're really, especially at the system level, asking people to think about, if you're trying to expand the availability of rental assistance in your community, which programs might you turn to, and why we called it putting the funding pieces together is you really have to think about these all as a set of programs and determining which programs are going to be used for which uses in a way that creates a comprehensive solution to homelessness in your community. So you may end up deciding that you have prioritized a lot of other programs for the permanent housing interventions, and where you really need to scale up is another eligible use for ESG. So not telling you to take that off the table, but just encouraging you to ask the question first about whether there's a permanent solution that's needed to be supported through those funds. Next slide, please. So part 2 of the guide is where you can dive into the much more detailed information about the key state and federal resources that are included. Again, covering the categories of information that I discussed earlier, including some tips and guidance around the most strategic uses of those funds. And then it also includes a table that links to other relevant state funding programs that we didn't create the detailed information on, but that you might also want to be diving into. Next slide, please. So this just shows you the kind of the range of programs that are included for the more detailed descriptions and where the funds are distributed to. So whether they go to cities, counties, directly to housing development agencies. In the case of some of the healthcare resources, they go to managed care health plans. So just so you'll know how they come into your community and who you might need to be engaging into discussion to think about the strategic uses. Next slide, please. So here's an example of the kind of information that's provided in this part of the guide. This is for the Encampment Resolution Funding Program. So again, we walk through the funding and timing information, how many funds have been invested into that program or are coming into the state from other funding sources, the eligible activities for those funding sources, here, as much as possible, we took the information directly from the program information that's publicly available so that it directly aligns with the language being used by the administrators of the funding source. We give a quick update on the implementation status. In this case, there was a NOFA that was released in December 2022. Funds were awarded in 2023, and additional rounds of funds would be awarded through other NOFAs. And I believe in this case, the guide came out in October and the funds were released in December. The NOFA was released in December. And again, we don't update every time a NOFA comes out, but you'll always know where to go to get the detailed information and know the status. And then we provide a few tips of how to think about using those funds within your community. And in this case, really focusing on solutions for unsheltered homelessness that connect people to interim shelter with clear pathways to permanent housing, looking at ways to bolster existing and successful models, or also try or test new approaches aligned with best practices for addressing the needs of folks who are staying in encampments. And then a few tips about how to think about being competitive in seeking these funds. Next slide, please. And then this is just indicates the programs for which we didn't do the more detailed description and information, but you can link to the funding source web pages to understand more about these specific programs. And over time, it might be that some of these programs get the more detailed descriptions in future editions, but we've tried to focus the detailed descriptions on those programs in which there really are system level conversations to be had about how to use those funds, where in this case, on this page, for example, a lot of the CalOES programs provide grants directly to nonprofit organizations, and there isn't really a system level conversation to be had about how to best use those funds in the community, at least in most communities. Next slide, please. So again, just that's the basics of what's in the funding guide. We really do hope it helps people better understand the complex array of funding that's available and coming into communities. And especially if you're maybe more on the services side and want to better understand the housing funding programs, or you're on the housing, you do a lot of housing programs, but you don't really understand the healthcare programs that are being administered by the state, that we hope it both allows folks to learn and understand more, but especially to think more about how do those funds get used in my community? How can we have more strategic conversations about how to best use those resources? Cody, I'll turn it back to you, see if you have any final thoughts before we go to Q&A.
No, that was great. Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, just looking forward to hearing from you all. And if you have any, as Matthew mentioned, we do a refresh of this, or we try to do a refresh of this every year. We're hoping to keep it as updated as possible in the future. So if you have other ideas for ways that this guide could be helpful for you all, we're definitely open to hearing that as well. But yeah, looking forward to hearing any questions.
Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions in the chat right now, but we would like to invite questions either in the chat, or if you want, you can come off of mute by raising your hand and we'll take you off of mute. But what questions do you have for Matthew or Cody about this crosswalk, about braiding and leveraging funds? What might they be able to answer for you? And we'll give it a moment to, in case anyone's typing.
Maybe I'll provide another prompt that folks don't have questions, but you have thoughts about what you'd like to see in a future version of the guide, or information that would be helpful complement to what we just described. That would also be more than welcome to, because we want to make sure this guide is very useful at the local level, and welcome feedback on what could help make it more useful.
And I would add, if anyone has been using the guide, we'd love to hear from you as well. For what purpose and how has it worked out for you? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions right now. Give it just another couple of seconds. Don't want to belabor the point if there are no questions, but want to certainly give enough time for questions to come up. Okay, I don't think we have any questions, Cody and Matthew. Oh, thank you, Cody. You can always email with questions at calich@bcsh.ca.gov. I'll make sure that we put that information into the weekly wrap up for office hours. Thank you so much for that, Cody. So since we are not seeing any other questions, we can go ahead and wrap for the week. Thank you so much to Matthew and Cody for your presentation today. And again, we will put that questions or comments email into the email that we send out this week summing up. But thank you all of you for your attendance this week, and we will see you next week. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks for having us.